All right, and we are live today with another Friday, noon Pacific Standard Time book discussion. Today's topic is Angela Duckworth's great book, Grit. Fantastic read, enjoyed the heck out of it. Now, for those of you that are new, that haven't tuned into one of these book discussions before, I do them every Friday talking about something leadership management related, and really it's a little different. It's not a summary. I'm just hitting the highlights, the things that jumped out to me that I think are applicable for frontline leaders out there that you can put into practice. So if you have comments, if you have questions, if you've checked out the book before and there's some things you want to talk about, then drop down into the comments section. We can kind of keep this discussion going. Otherwise, with that all being said, I'm going to dive right in. Again, first of all, enjoyed the book. Just kind of a brief look at it. Really enjoyed the book. The topic itself, grit, is really about what it takes to be successful. And so Angela Duckworth is a researcher. She's done decade, if not decades, of research into grit with people, talking about going to the West Point Military Academy, talking with Fortune 500 companies, talking in the academic arena, and really kind of diving in and trying to figure out what makes up grit and who has it, who doesn't, and how much does it lend itself to success. And so, MP, so good to see you here. So really, again, engaging read. She has decades of stories, a ton of stories in this book and examples of grit to illustrate all of her points. So the read itself moves along pretty darn quickly. She did lose me probably at about the 70% of the book's point where all of the stories just kind of started stacking up on one another. But in general, very good read and a book that I would recommend. So with that said, we're going to dive right into kind of some of the highlights that I have. So talking about opening up the discussion in regards to grit. So a little past the introduction, she's talking about showing up to stuff right now. And one of the first highlights I'd like to bring up is, first, these exemplars of grit, these people who embodied grit, were unusually resilient and hardworking. Second, they knew in a very, very deep way what it was they wanted. They not only had determination, that's what we usually think of with grit, but they had direction as well. So the first lesson about grit is it's not just about perseverance and determination. It's also about having a purpose, a strong why, shall we say, which, by the way, is a great segue into next week's book, Start With Why by Simon Sinek, one of the classics. Everybody out there has read it. I'll be discussing that next Friday at noon. Moving on, the second point that she brings up is the counterbalance to grit, to that determination, and that's the reason that people are successful. The counter argument to that is the very common belief that it's all about talent, that it is about, God's gifts and a genius that people naturally have, and that it isn't grit that does it. It is actually talent that does it. So she takes a moment to kind of start undermining that argument. And I think most people that have been out there can realize that talent is great. But if you don't have the determination to work with that talent, you're not going to go anywhere. And I'll raise my hand on that. One of my great talents was swimming. However, I didn't enjoy swimming. So while I was still really good at it, I never reached my full potential because I didn't put in the work on a day in, day out basis to develop that talent into something more. So with that said, a couple of takeaways here. The human individual lives usually far within his or her limits. He or she possesses powers of various sorts which they habitually fail to use. He energizes below his maximum and he behaves below his optimum. The plain fact remains that men the world over, quoting from somebody here, James, the plain fact remains that men the world over possess amounts of resource which only very exceptional individuals push to their extremes to use. The point being made here, glad you like the topic, Kim. The point being made here is that if talent was everything, then we all have talents. We all have potential, but we don't realize, and most people we see on a day in, day out basis, they have the talent, but they don't marshal that talent. They don't develop that talent. And so it's a points being made here that as human beings, we have enormous possibilities, each and every one of us. However, very, very few of us actually tap into that and develop those resources into something more than just possibility. Moving quickly beyond that, and I don't feel the need to belabor that whole the church of talent, shall we say, in regards to why that lends itself to success. Certainly, having talent is a huge help. But I would argue in very many cases, and in leadership in particular, you actually don't have to have talent to be an exceptional leader. The reason I say that is because you can develop that talent. You can develop skill sets. So even if you have an individual who is naturally gregarious, outgoing, gets along with people, has an analytical mind, if they don't develop any of those traits that they have, you can pass them by. The example I use a lot is with golf. Now, you have to have talent, I think, to be on the professional tour. However, you can get instruction. You can practice yourself to being a scratch golfer, being able to shoot par, which puts you ahead of 99% of the golfers that are out there. So you can get into that 99th percentile through practice. I would argue there's a number of people with the talent to be on the PGA Tour, but don't have the grit or the perseverance to see through that. So the talent argument is very helpful. Can definitely speed things along, but I don't think it's a requirement for success in most endeavors. A second point that she makes is if we overemphasize talent, what we do is we underemphasize everything else. And what she's talking about here is the chapters labeled Effort Counts Twice. All right, so getting into what is typically considered a grit sort of attribute, and that is effort towards something. With everything perfect, and she's quoting Nietzsche here, love this. With everything perfect, we do not ask how it came to be. Instead, we rejoice in the present fact as though it came out of the ground by magic. It's our celebration of those people that are absolutely amazing at whatever it is that they do. We assume it's talent. We take the present tense right here, and we don't look at all of the work that went in, the hours and hours of practice. And every single genius in a particular arena has an enormous amount, an unbearably large amount of effort that went into bringing that to the fore. We prefer our excellence fully formed. We prefer mystery to the mundanity of hard work. For if we think of genius as something magical, we are not obliged to compare ourselves and find ourselves lacking. One of the reasons that we looked at talent as an excuse for not working hard to develop something is because if we believe it's talent, then we aren't on the hook for developing ourselves. We don't have to own up to the mistakes and our shortfalls, shall we say, in certain areas. She comes up with a very simple formula for this. I'll throw this up here. And that is talent times effort equals skill. All right? So if you take your initial talent and you put forth the effort, you will start developing skills in a particular arena. But that isn't enough. Skills plus effort, or times effort in this particular case, taking those skills and applying and honing those are what equals achievement. All right, so you take the talent plus effort, that gives you skill. You take the skill plus effort, and that equals achievement. And that's where the name of the title of the chapter comes in. Effort counts twice. That is a truth of grit, that you do need to put forth that effort. You do need to have that perseverance. And you know, I don't think she's necessarily shying away from that at all in this book. Now, a couple of things in getting into how gritty are you. And she actually has a test in here where you can kind of gauge where your grit is. She developed it. She's put it out to tons of people, students, business people, academics, all of that kind of measuring grit. And so question is how gritty are you? Taking a look at it. One of the takeaways that I had from it, and I underlined, is grit is more about stamina than intensity. And I think when we step back, we realize that that's where that perseverance comes in. It's not about a huge initial push. It is about keeping that push over time. That's a demonstration of grit. But beyond that, getting into the passion and the direction, we get that right at the beginning of this. I commented on that particular one where it's not just about perseverance and following through with something. It's actually loving what you do. And it's doing what you love, but not just falling in love, staying in love. I like that as a really good point. You might find that you enjoyed something, you developed a passion for it, you developed a little bit of grit and perseverance into honing your craft, but over time you can fall out of love with that. And what that does is that then diminishes the amount of effort that you want to put into something. So just a little takeaway that even if you have that passion, that thing that you are working towards, you need to be putting exercise into continuing to find enjoyment in that, and that goes for your job. That's why I kind of that's why I underlined this one to talk about. It's important that we get in touch with the things that we enjoy about our job, that we get in touch with the things that brought us, to want this job in the first place. So make sure that you're spending a little bit of time, kind of nurturing that passion you have for your job. There we go. So kind of summing up, grit has two components, passion and perseverance. So now we're starting to get to some of these conclusions here. What we may have originally thought was that grit was all about perseverance, but the passion is what underlines that perseverance and allows it to actually take place. Enthusiasm is common. So talking about this equating of those two principles. Enthusiasm is common, but endurance is rare. All right? Lots of people get excited about something and they get started on it and then they don't finish it. We might see that with our to-do list. All right? You might have your to-do list, if it's anything like mine, is riddled with half-complete projects that we got started, got taken away from it, and then all of a sudden couldn't get back to it in as timely a fashion as we really would have preferred. So grit, passion, and perseverance, not just enthusiasm, but endurance as well. All right? My compass, once I found all the parts, quoting from the book again, and I'll discuss why I underline this. My compass, once I found all the parts and put it together, keeps pointing me in the same direction, week after month after year. All right, so it is a process, and she'll talk a little bit more about this later in the book, but really developing your grit. All right, really trying to knuckle down on that a little bit more requires effort in putting it together. She'll talk about one of the fallacies that you're all of a sudden just going to find your passion. It's just going to be lying there and it's fully formed. That's not the way it works. You have to work at it. You have to cultivate that interest and some of the other things with it. And so, but once you have it, once you've developed that passion, it's easier for you to fix your point on what you're going for and to keep that as your true north. That's what gives you that sense of direction moving forward. And you create kind of a virtuous loop where you have that clear sense of direction. You have the perseverance moving forward towards it, and you can recognize where you are in relation to getting close to it. Mama, it's so good to see you here. Interesting point, though, in her studies on grit, and again, she's created a test, and it's in the book, on grit and kind of engaging it. One thing that is interesting is that people get grittier over time. As they get older, their scores tend to naturally inflate. All right, and I think that's what I would say is relatively, I don't want to say obvious, but it's one of those things where as you go through more things, as you get an understanding of this life and the way that the world works, you realize that to accomplish anything that you really want to, anything worthwhile, it's going to take some work. So when you're younger, those things might have been easy. The map was already laid out as to what you were supposed to do. The directions were clear from your professors, from your parents, from maybe your first couple of bosses based on the position you were in. But as you develop, those plans get less clear. You realize that you have to take on more of the responsibility if you want to get the same results. So just an interesting call away that The older you get, generally the grittier you are, the more you're able to persevere through things and work on your passions. Nadia, good to see you here as well. Next takeaway I have, just thumbing through here. So now we're starting to talk about the four areas that will get you towards grit, that will start helping you in that area. Growing grit from the inside out. So the first area is interest. Number one, the first thing that you want to work on if you want to become grittier is look to what you are interested in. Research shows that people are enormously more satisfied with their jobs when they do something that fits their personal interests. People perform better at work when when what they do interests them. And so I highlighted this. If you want to establish grit, you want to do something in an area where you're going to have passion. All right? And the way that you find that passion is you look for areas that you are interested in. Sherry King, nice to see you here. So you look for areas that you're interested in. But one of the reasons I highlighted this is as a leader, it's important that you look for ways to bring your team into the discussion on how the operation works, that you are looking for areas that they excel at, that they are interested in. And this is one of those reasons that even if you have 10 people doing the same job, I'm a big fan of finding what people are good at and what they're interested in and set aside a little time where they can specialize and work on that. It doesn't mean that they don't do certain aspects of the job. They all do. But each one of them might have an area where they specialize in or they spend a little bit more time. And it's an ability at that point to cultivate that interest, because not for nothing, if people are more interested, they're going to be more productive. They're going to work better. So make sure that you are sparking that interest. This is the other reason that employee engagement is so important, because when you bring people into the discussion, when you give them a stake in how the department works, how the organization works, you look for their ideas that you can put into place. When you do that, you create that sense of ownership. And we are usually interested in the things that we own more than the things that we don't own. So just kind of a big takeaway there from a leadership standpoint and managing your employees. Look to tap into those interests. Not only are you going to make them grittier, because this is how to work from the inside out, but you're also going to make them just flat out more productive as well. So we've heard a lot of stats, and this was one that just kind of jumped out to me because it was even it was worse than I thought it was, and that was the studies in regards to engagement at work. And so it turns out that the U.S. has a horrible score on here, and I didn't actually write that one down. But it is actually worse around the world as far as engagement is concerned. So worldwide, only 13% of adults call themselves engaged at work. Only 13%. I'm kind of doing the math in my head. That's 1 in every 8 employees thinks that they are engaged in work. So there's a huge opportunity there. That means even if you are doing well with engagement, probably only 50% of your staff would classify themselves as engaged with work. So if you want to cultivate interest, you want to cultivate grit, you want to get those benefits, start engaging with your employees. Ask them what they think you should do in certain situations. When they come to you a question, well, what do you think we should do? When you have a problem, take it out to the team. Hey, we've got an issue. We're falling behind as far as our fourth quarter numbers are concerned. Does anybody have any ideas on how we can turn this around? Bring them into that discussion. When they're engaged, you're going to find you get a whole lot of benefits, not just extra grit in this case. And I will just keep using that word. I'll be interested to see what the word count is on grit in this discussion. Talking through interest. So getting out of leadership, let's talk personal with you. One of the things is you want to cultivate that sense of what she describes in here as novelty. All right, you want to cultivate, curiosity in the way that things work, different areas of interest, that sort of thing. So the quote that she has is, if babies didn't have a strong drive for novelty, they wouldn't learn as much, and that would make it less likely they would survive. So the big thing about interest is it's hardwired into our brains. Now, we might learn to move away from our interests and move away from our curiosity, but it is something that is innate in all of us. that we naturally have a curious spirit. If we didn't have that curiosity, and hey, anybody who's raised a child knows they're insanely curious. If you don't have that sense of curiosity, you're not going to understand the world around you. And so you want to cultivate that, and you can cultivate it. It's inside each of us. Personal accountability. Kim, you have a great comment there. Even if you might not be in your passion job, you still need to try to find areas to be engaged. Personal accountability. Absolutely. And we'll discuss a little bit of that too here. And this was a big takeaway for me, but we'll get to that here in just a minute, Kim. Next comment here is ask yourself a few simple questions. So if you want to cultivate that interest, realizing that it's innate, our curiosity is there inside, we just have to bring it out. Ask yourself a few simple questions. What do I like to think about? Where does my mind wander? What do I really care about? What matters most to me? How do I enjoy spending my time? And the flip side of that is asking yourself, what do you find absolutely unbearable? Sometimes it's important to eliminate options and it becomes easier to see other ones. But just asking yourself those sorts of questions is hugely important into really finding some direction in where your interests lie. Then what do? One word, you experiment. We don't do, in my opinion, we don't do nearly enough experimentation. Certainly on the job. And the example I use is one of my private coaching clients discussing with him. He owns a wholesaler of art supplies, and talking through some things in regards to things that he'd like to do and some of the concerns that he has. And the concerns are a lot of what ifs. And the issue is he has complete control. Have a transparent discussion and try some of these what ifs. Most of them that we discussed could be dialed back. It could be that after 2 weeks you're like, no, that doesn't work. Go back to the way it was. You have more freedom to experiment than you probably realize. And that's one way that you can cultivate those interests, which is important in cultivating your own grit. So once you have developed a sense of interest in a particular area, all right, or maybe even just a few areas, the second thing to do, not surprisingly, is practice. And I liked this particular graph right here. Woo! And this shows the level of skill over time. Okay, so we take time across the board here, and then this is the level of skill. Trying to look at myself in reverse on the camera there. And what we find is over time, most people have a similar trajectory. Now, if you have a lot of talent, you might move up that ladder quicker. But what happens is some people drop out. All right, that was the first one. The second one is people get satisfied with their own development. And then the other people are constantly looking for improvement, and those are the experts. And she calls it arrested development here, and I've seen it somewhere else, and I can't remember when. Why is it that all of us don't type at 120, 130 words a minute? The reason is we stopped developing the talent of typing. Once we got to 50, 60, 70 words, hey, we're fine. So we stopped focusing on the improvement. We continued typing, but we didn't get any better because we didn't have that goal of getting any higher. We didn't develop that skill. So that's really what we mean by arrested development. You stop developing it. You get to a certain point, you're happy, and you move on into something else. And that can be fine if you don't have a real interest or passion. However, if you do have that interest and passion, that's, a kick in the pants to keep moving forward with it. So the reason that what she really highlights here and why you might have that arrested development, as she calls it, you aren't improving because you are not doing deliberate practice. Going back to that typing, you're getting practice every single day typing. So why is it that you aren't moving from 60 and 70 words a minute to 120 words a minute? Well, because you're not doing deliberate practice. It isn't just doing, and she did a ton of research on this. It isn't just doing an activity. It is doing an activity for certain purposes. Working to find your Achilles heel, for instance, the specific aspect of, in this case, music that needs problem solving. What is your specific area that you need to improve on? The other thing to do is to reflect on what you're doing well, what you're not, reflecting on past performance with an eye towards where to improve it. This is all deliberate practice. Depending on what it is that your passion is, you can look at weak points, you can look at points of success, how you've been doing in a particular area, but you want to practice with a purpose. Deliberate practice predicted advancing to further rounds in final competition. She's talking about the spelling bee right now. So she did a lot of research with the National Spelling Bee. Deliberate practice predicted advancing to further rounds in final competition far better than any of the other kinds of preparation. So they'd play Scrabble. They'd do word games. They would read for fun. All right, these are all things that spelling bee champions do to be able to spell crazy words. But it was the deliberate practice and the time spent doing that that really mattered. Again, I will use the example of typing. Are you deliberately trying to push yourself to type faster? I'm not saying that you need to type faster. That's not what I'm saying. But I'm using an example that pretty much all of us can recognize that at a certain point we stopped in that development. But it is that deliberate practice. That is what decides more than anything else. When she looked at all the studies, when she looked at all the research in regards to it, that determined where people fit into the final hierarchy of the spelling bee more than anything else that they were doing. So, talking about practice and getting into the details of it, this was what I was looking for earlier here. So if you want to practice better, you've found your interest, now you want to practice and start cultivating that interest. There's 4 areas that you want to get to. A clearly defined stretch goal. So it might not be typing 60, 70 words. You want to type at 120 words a minute. Get clear on what that goal is. Make sure it's out there. That's your stretch goal. 2, full concentration and effort. So this is where you are focused on typing well. So this is why you end up, you aren't typing creatively when you're doing those tests to see how fast you type. You aren't doing that. You are focused and concentrating on that particular effort. Immediate and informative feedback. All right, so that's the 3rd area. All right, so if you want to practice better, deliberate practice to work on your grit, clearly defined stretch goal, full concentration and effort, immediate and informative feedback, and repetition with reflection and refinement. All right, so think about it. All right, so those are the 4 areas to practice better. The way to make this easier for you, and she briefly hits on it here, is to make it a habit. It may be that whatever it is that you want to improve upon, you set aside a certain time every single day, and that is going to be my half an hour, my hour, my 2 hours, whatever it is that I am going to practice and bring all of myself, all of my mind to a particular activity. Nope, I'm going to skip that. So the 3rd area, all right, in developing grit from the inside out. First is finding your interest. 2nd is practice. 3rd is purpose, right? The more common sequence is to start out with a relatively self-oriented interest. Learn self-disciplined practice, and finally integrate that work with an other-centered purpose. All right, so you start with that interest, you practice it, and then it becomes a purpose. And this may be one of those things that's a test as to whether you have the right interest or not. Purpose means the intention to contribute to the well-being of others. So just kind of wanted to have that. I hadn't really heard. I mean, we kind of understand purpose, but actually just having it called out there. How you see your work is more important than your job title. So getting into your point on this, Kim, all right, you might not have passion for the job, but seeing what the impact of your job is to those around you can give you a greater sense of purpose. All right, you define the purpose behind your job, not the title. Even the duties that are, prescribed for that particular job role don't necessarily create the purpose. You might be there to help everybody else have an easier time at work so they can bring more of themselves to their families at home. That's a great purpose, wonderful purpose. A lot of people assume that what they need to do is to find their calling. All right? A calling is not something that's fully formed thing that you find. That's, again, looking at all of her research. We want that calling, but it's not something that's just there that we pick off of a shelf at the grocery store and take with us home. It is something that is going to have to be developed. Continually look at what you do and ask how it connects to other people, how it connects to the bigger picture, how it can be an expression of your deepest values. So again, the work that you're doing right now, that can be something that has a higher calling, a higher purpose, because you are helping other individuals, maybe the teammates around you, maybe the customers, whatever it happens to be. You can look around for that and find a deeper purpose behind what you do. So kind of talking more about this development of a purpose as opposed to just a grabbing on and having it fully formed. Everyone has a spark, and that's the very beginning of purpose. That spark is something that you are interested in. All right. Next, you need to observe someone who is purposeful, the purposeful role model. That's one of the hacks to this, whether it's practice, whether it's purpose, whatever, is trying to find somebody who's doing what you're doing already that you can emulate. All right. So you find that spark. All right. You find that interest, and then you find somebody that is doing it the way that you want it done, with the purpose behind it, and then you start looking at them as a template to move forward. That's a great way of getting ahead of this purpose issue. 3 things as far as purpose is concerned. All right, 3 takeaways, and this kind of sums up a bunch of the stories. Again, this book is rich with examples and with stories from her research, real life people that are grit paragons, as she calls them. The first comment is reflecting on how the work you're already doing can make a positive contribution to society. How can what you're doing right now, if you want to get better at purpose, at developing a purpose, how can what you're doing right now benefit society at large? I gave the example before. You might be in a mundane line level job, but what you can do is you can bring your best self. You can help those that are around you. And with that, you brighten their lives and allow them to bring more energy to their work, find more enjoyment, and hopefully to home as well. That's a way of doing it. But look where you're at. Look what you're currently doing and see what you can do to bring your better self to it to create a better purpose for society at large. Second comment, thinking about how in a small but meaningful way you can change your current work to enhance its connection to your core values. All right, so whatever it is that you believe about people, about society, about the work that you do, how can you make small changes to what you're doing to align those things a little bit better? That allows you to jump up to your purpose. Third thing is finding inspiration in a purposeful role model. If you want to help develop that purpose, then look outward for a role model who you can emulate. That it accomplishes a couple of things. It allows you to, I want to say pick their brain. Even if they're somebody famous who you don't have any interaction with, you can pick their brain by what they've done to get there, whatever their story happens to be. But the second thing it does, and why it's important to have a role model and to find one, is that it proves to your inner self that it can be done. You may still have doubts that you can accomplish this, but when you see somebody else who already is, those doubts kind of wither. And that's a good example for a lot of things in work and in life, is to find somebody who's doing it already. And then you get some knowledge, but it also puts away all of those demons in your head that say you can't do this particular thing. Fourth area. All right, so we've talked interest, we've talked practice, we've talked purpose, and the fourth one is hope. All right, and I'll show how that ties in. Big question when I was first reading it, but then it becomes kind of obvious when you get through it. So I lose my place there. This seminal experiment, and I'll explain the experiment, it proved for the first time that it isn't suffering that leads to hopelessness. It's suffering you think you can't control. So they were working through dogs. And old study when they didn't have the safeguards in place, but they were delivering electrical shocks. But some dogs had the ability to press a pedal to stop the shocks. And what happened was is they came back to those particular dogs, and those that didn't have the ability to stop that pain from occurring just accepted the pain regardless of the new environment that they happened to be in. And so it's important to realize hope plays a big part in our grit and our ability to persevere. All right, interest, practice. So I guess we take those 4 things that she talks about developing your inner grit. Interest is something that talks about passion. Practice is perseverance. Purpose is getting into passion again. Hope is actually about perseverance and the ability to persevere. When you believe that you can change things for the better, it makes it easier for you to persevere through. Optimists habitually search for temporary and specific causes of their suffering. So when you are going through hard times, when you are failing, it's going to happen. As you've developed an interest, you've developed a purpose, and as you're practicing and building your skill sets, there's going to be lots of times where you fail. Now, an optimist or someone with hope believes that those things are temporary and specific, whereas the pessimist assumes permanent and pervasive causes are to blame. I'm a loser. I can't do this. Nobody in my family's ever done this. You know, they look outward, all right? And that kills the hope, which is a good excuse to stop persevering towards your goals. And so a couple of things on here. She starts talking about children. And you know, a lot of research, she's an academic, a lot of research takes place with children because you take away a whole bunch of the ancillary and different things that can go into upbringing, that sort of thing, and you try to get to the heart of the human essence, shall we say. Children have never been very good at listening to their elders. I love this one. So children have never been very good at listening to their elders, but they have never failed to imitate them. It's author and activist James Baldwin that says that, and she kind of quotes it here. So it's the imitation that they're looking for, being the example for others. And a lot of times I'll draw correlations between employees and children and your role as a leader to your role as a parent. And what that really is getting at is our general human traits that we have. We are very apt at imitating those that are around us. Listening to them, taking advice can often be something that's different. The thing that she's getting at in this is the difference between a growth mindset, all right, undermining getting into a growth mindset and a fixed mindset is what she's getting at here. So if you have a growth mindset, you can work towards something and build. If you have a fixed mindset, you believe that you are the way that you are and you can't improve things. All right, this gets back to that study where those that learned that they could control their environment a little bit naturally brought more control to their work later on in life. Whereas those that didn't have control over their environment, bad environment, just took things as it was and assumed that they were never going to change. So it's the difference between a growth mindset and a fixed mindset. So 3 areas of cultivating hope. All right, you want to have a growth mindset that you can change your environment, that you can change the world around you, that you can change how you interact with people, that you can develop skills. You have to cultivate that growth mindset. And all you need to do, this is just me talking, just look at certain skill sets that you've developed over time. It can be your current job. When you first got into the job, you probably didn't know the system. You probably didn't know some of the tricks as far as dealing with customers, but you learned those things. So we all have that growth ability, but tap into that growth mindset. Second thing, and this is hugely important, one of my takeaways from this, because I'm really hard on myself oftentimes, and that is an optimistic self-talk, that you can accomplish what you want to, that it can happen. One of the reasons to find a role model is that somebody else has done it, so I can do it. And, you know, doubling down on that role model, I always come back to physical achievements. And so we look at, say, Roger Bannister broke the 4-minute mile, I don't know, back in the 50s. And over the course of like the next 2 years, 9 other people broke the 4-minute mile barrier. It had been something that people had been butting up against for decades. Yet once one person achieved it, then a whole bunch of others, and these are trained athletes, all right? But still you have that deep-seated mindset of, well, if somebody else did it, now I can do it, as opposed to it being impossible for anyone to break that 4-minute mile. 2-minute or 2-hour marathon is the one that's coming up. Eventually somebody's going to break that 2-hour marathon. And I bet when they do, over the course of the next few years, and they've been working on this for decades, over the course of the next few years, you're going to see, I'll say 5 or 6 people break it. Yeah, that's a stretch. But okay, at least a few. So looking at that optimistic self-talk. All right. And then the third area is perseverance over adversity. If you want to cultivate hope, have a growth mindset. All right. Optimistic self-talk. All right. Think good thoughts. And then perseverance over anxiety. And that's proving it out over time. All right. When you have conquered things, and this is why I think that grit improves over time. People get grittier as they get older, is because they've seen the benefit, or they've had more instances of perseverance over adversity over time. They've been able to see where if they stuck with something, they were able to get through, which gives them hope for being grittier in the future. Next thing, moving on, and starting to talk now. So you're talking about the development of grit within yourself, creating a culture of grit. All right. The real way, I like this. The real way to become a great swimmer is to join a great team. And this is talking, I think, Rowdy Gaines, I want to say. And so if you wanted to be better, if you wanted to be a better swimmer, if you want to be a better leader, then surround yourself with great leaders, with great swimmers. And in the day-to-day work, be mindful of who it is that you are associating with. I mean, whatever the study is, many have already heard it out there, is that your income is the average of the 5 people that you are closest to. Your 5 closest friends. Your income is the average of that. And so be mindful of who your friends are, because that has an impact. But it has an impact as far as your skill sets are concerned as well. If you want to get better at something, surround yourself with individuals who are already good at it. And you will naturally lift yourself up. If you're around a lot of people who are gritty, you are going to act grittier. And that's, I don't think much needs to be talked about, but it's one of those things, one of those aha moments. Oh, duh. If I want to get better at something, I just need to surround myself or look for those individuals who happen to be better at that. Talking about Jamie Dimon, who is the CEO of JP Morgan Chase, one of the biggest banks in the world, is one of the things I didn't really know is how passionate he is on culture. I wasn't aware of that. And what he talks about is it takes a relentless, absolutely relentless communication. It's what you say and it's how you say it. But it also may be more about how often you say it. So when we're talking about grit, or when we're talking about anything in regards to leadership and your work, a lot of it's going to be talking about it and talking about it regularly. A couple of points that I typically make on here is people will associate the importance of something to how often you're talking about it. It's why it's important to put goals up on a bulletin board and to put tracking measures up on a bulletin board. That's talking about something regularly. People will assign an importance to it. But also, it's important to be repetitive on your messaging, because people don't always get it. There may be something going on. They may be working out a legitimate work problem in their head and not giving you the full focus. So until you repeat it, they don't have that chance to absorb it. So an absolutely relentless focus on communication is one of those things that can really improve your ability to drive grit into your organization. The origin, I like this. This actually comes from the 1800s, a book that is talked about at West Point, the U.S. Military Academy for the Army. The origin of great leadership begins with the respect of the commander for his subordinates. The origin of great leadership isn't the employees respecting you. The origin, the first place that shows up, is your respect for them as a leader. Okay, so respect them first. You get what you give. All right, and the quicker you want to receive it means the quicker you need to give it. So give respect first. Just great takeaway. What they worked on here, and this was an interesting study. So at West Point, again, military academy, kids have gone through 2 years. It's two-year application process. They get in. And then what they first have to do is basically basic training for West Point, and they call it the Beast. And what they found is that ages before, 12% of students or applicants would drop out of West Point. They've been working on this for 2 years to get to apply, and then they drop out after a couple of weeks. All right, so 12% of people way back in the day. Now, what was talked about a lot then and put in place was hazing, or punishment, teasing, whatever you want to call it. And that was something that was supposed to develop grit. Hey, war isn't fun, so you need to realize that bad things are going to happen. So they tried to develop grit in the cadets, by hazing. It was something that was actually looked to improve upon. So they went away from that. Back in the early 90s, I think it was actually banned. It started going away in the 80s. And by the turn of the century, it was down to a 6%. So they cut it in half, the amount of attrition that they had. But what they did since then is they moved to more of a developmental model. All right. So in one case, you use fear to get your subordinates to achieve those standards, the hazing. All right. And in the other case, you lead from the front. Now, what leading from the front looks like in this case is when you see somebody that's struggling, you don't pick on them. That was the hazing mode. All right. The other mode might be that you just don't do anything and you let them figure it out for themselves. The third mode is that you actually look to develop them. What I'm going to do is sit down with them and put together a training plan to improve their performance. And what they saw at West Point is you had 12% attrition in that first week in the 80s. Then you stopped hazing and that went down to 6%. Where it's at right now is it's at 2% with this new model of an attrition rate. Again, the standards are still the same as far as completing tests, as far as achievement in physical and mental areas. That's all the same. However, they don't have as many people dropping out, and in fact, they're actually improving some of those metrics with the developmental model as opposed to that fear model. And we see that a lot in business where we want to cheat, I'll call it, and try to motivate through fear, but that's not what gets you the motivation that really you're looking for. And last comment here. So one of the things we talk about a culture of grit. So kind of rounding out this discussion is talking about what compete means. Compete actually is a word that comes from the Latin. All right? It means to strive together. Compete literally means, when you break it down in its Latin roots, strive together. Two key factors promote excellence in individuals and in teams: deep and rich support and relentless challenge to improve. That is what's going to make a grittier workforce, and that's what you need to strive for, is deep and rich support amongst the team, between you and the team, and a relentless challenge to improve. That's what really develops grit. So, again, enjoyed the book, enjoyed a lot, lots and lots of stories in it to illustrate the point. So it was really wonderful from that perspective. A couple of good takeaways from myself. But if you want to be a grittier person, if you want to develop grit in your team, it's really those 4 areas that you want to get into. Find an interest, practice it with deliberate practice, develop a purpose based on that practice, and then keep in touch with hope. That was the one that kind of really jumped out to me, that positive self-talk in particular, and reflection on achieving things over time. That's something that's going to carry you forward. That will develop grit, and then look to have more of a developmental mindset with your team. That's going to actually help them be grittier not making things tough. All right, things are already tough, but actually just working with them and helping them to achieve and overcome things. So great discussion. Loved it. The book Grit, Angela Duckworth, add it to your reading list. It's a good one and it goes by relatively quickly. And next week, noon Pacific Standard Time on Friday, we're going to be discussing Start With Why, the classic by Simon Sinek, and we'll go through that together. In the meantime, if you ever have any questions, you can always reach out to me. I answer questions all day long on leadership and management, so cm@cameronmorrissey.com. Hit the questions here in the comment section. Private message me through any of the social media channels that I'm on right now. And I will see you all next week. Take care, everybody. Bye-bye.